So the Indianapolis Colts have some tough decisions to make going into this offseason. Now, that's really the case with every offseason, right? It's not like just this offseason is tough decisions. In fact, last offseason was perhaps the most important offseason I personally had ever witnessed as a Colts fan. I've been a fan for nearly 20 years. Last offseason, the picture was entirely different than it was going into this offseason because we did not have a quarterback, and it was clear that we needed to go get one. We didn't have a head coach, despite the fact that I think Jeff Saturday caught way too hard of a time for simply accepting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity as a head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, albeit we knew that that wasn't going to work out great, and we knew we needed a head coach. Point being is going into the offseason, we knew we needed a head coach and we needed a quarterback. And in this league, if you don't have a head coach and a quarterback, you don't have anything. I mean, you're in a world of trouble. And it was an offseason in which whatever they did and whatever they, accomplished in that offseason or didn't accomplish was going to set the trajectory for the franchise for the next 5 to 10 years. And I think as far as making sure that the trajectory was a positive one and that we were moving in the right direction, the Colts passed the test. Chris Ballard and company passed that test with flying colors, and I think that's basically just undisputable. I don't know how anyone could argue against that. Did the Colts have a good offseason last year? Absolutely. But this offseason is perhaps equally as important because you look at the progress that was just made. It's not like we're now all of a sudden a Super Bowl team, right? We have some momentum for sure, but we got to keep it up because we just witnessed a promising season, but in a fun season. But the standard is a little bit different than it once was, right? All of a sudden we can find the joy in a 9-8 season. That wasn't how things always were. But in this league, if you are not getting better, you are getting worse. And I truly believe that if the Colts were to roll into next season without making any significant improvements to this team, even with the return of Anthony Richardson, even with the progression and the continuity of the guys that we have in place, I think the Colts would end up being a sub 500 team. But the good news is this. Last offseason was the first time, perhaps since he's been the GM, that it felt like Chris Ballard had a real sense of urgency. Now, I've always liked the work that Chris Ballard has done, and I think Colts Nation at this point is probably split 50-50, 50 people liking him, 50 people not, or 50%, I guess, right? There's more than 100 Colts fans, I know, because of how many listens I tend to get on the show here. Not to, I have no delusions about the size of the channel, but there's more than 100 of you, at least eventually there's more than 100 of you, right? So I think that continues. I think we continue to see that sense of urgency out of Chris Ballard, particularly with the addition of Shane Steichen, particularly with how close it feels like this team might be, and the fact that the division is clearly rising. The AFC South, make no mistake about it, is the rising division in the NFL right now. And sometimes it is hard to tell whether or not a team is about winning and winning only. For me right now, the Colts look like they are in the business of trying to win and nothing else. This went from a rebuild to, hey, let's make a run. And that's what I think we're going to try to position ourselves to do going into this offseason. Now, of course, that's going to require us acquiring some more talent, as I already said. And the thing with acquiring talent in the NFL is that your approach to every offseason has to be fluid. You can't just be so rigid in the way you go about this because your needs on one given offseason at a certain position may be better addressed in the draft than they are in free agency. And perhaps another season, they may be better addressed in free agency than they are in the draft, and perhaps even through a trade, right? Kind of the pool of players in the draft class and the free agent class, these things change every year in terms of the talent levels and kind of the guys who are playmakers in those classes. That makes sense? I'm trying my best to make sense on that point. And it kind of just comes down, again, to the talent that's available to you in each of those respective classes. Now, it is a tough balance to figure out which one is which because, again, not a Madden franchise. You don't get just redo it if you make the mistake. You got to go through the timeline, and you got to get things right as you go along. But make no mistake, that is why Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen and the rest of the decision makers get paid the big bucks. They got to execute on this stuff. But before even thinking about bringing in the new talent and kind of how we can improve, you got to worry about what's in-house. Who is it that you retain, right? As is always the case, there's some tough decisions there because the reality is that you cannot keep everyone. And this offseason, we have some guys that are real difference makers on this team with expiring contracts. Many of you know who they are. Some of you may be learning that for the first time today. So I want to sift through it just a little bit, and I'm going to share where I stand on some of those guys, and I'll kind of talk about some of the depth pieces as well. I'll try not to waste too much of your time with that because I know nobody is interested in those types of things, but they do matter, and you don't care about depth until you care about depth, right? So it's not like we can't discuss that at all. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on all this stuff as well. But before we get into it, I have to introduce myself. My name is Justin. This right here is the Ride in the Bench Colts podcast. As always, I ask anyone that's enjoying the episode and watching on YouTube, go ahead, shoot it a like. It's going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. If you're listening to the audio version, go ahead, shoot a 5-star review. Let the people know how much you enjoy the show. Right now on YouTube, we're shooting for 2,500 subscribers. We're not even really all that close yet. We're still under 2,100. If you're one of those people that keeps coming back and you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. If you don't mind, help me get to where I want to be, 2,500, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, a billion. Before you know it, the entire world is going to be Colts fans. There's going to be Colts fans on Mars if I have my way by the time this thing is all said and done. But most importantly, let's just enjoy the episode. We've got a long offseason ahead of us, and let's talk about the re-signs, but we got to get the financials out of the way because the Colts right now going into this offseason have just under $64 million in cap space as it currently stands. Now, that may sound like a lot of money. In fact, that is a lot of money, right? If someone walked into your room, someone walked into my room, gave me $64 million, quite frankly, I'd be in a different room in short order, right? I'd be in a studio very quickly. So $64 million is a lot of money, of course, but I'm talking about in the context of NFL contracts in an offseason, right? So you're going to realize throughout the course of this episode, as I start talking about potential contract values, how quickly you can burn through $64 million without ever drafting somebody or ever signing a free agent. So I'm going to start with the depth pieces first to kind of get this out of the way. Yes, I'm going to make you wait for the goods for some of those big decisions. So let me just pull this up real quick to go through it. I see some names here. By the way, I didn't cover this. If you're getting your news from me, I mean, I'm flattered, more power to you, but I'm not the news guy. But if you were to look up guys with expiring contracts on the Colts, what you would see are Sagon Olabi, Cameron McGrone, Trevor Denbo, all on that list. They've all already been extended. So I would like to make that clear for those of you who don't know. I happen to love all of those re-signings. I think all of those are very good players. So I'm going to just talk about the guys that I kind of view as important pieces, I guess. Maybe I'll miss someone here, but Danny Pinter, I view as someone that I would like to have back in this league. You can't have too much depth on the offensive line. Danny Pinter was projected coming into this season to be a guy that was really going to be like the depth piece at guard and kind of like, remember Joe Haig? Do you remember when he was kind of the guy that we would just back up lineman and wherever he had to play, he would play? Danny Pinter was the guy that was going to do that this year. He ultimately ended up hurt, but I would like to see them bring him back and still address some more of the depth in this offseason. But Danny Pinter is a guy that I think can make that job a little bit easier if you just bring him back. I doubt there's going to be a lot of demand for his services on the open market. I think they're going to get that deal done. Juwan Winfrey. You got to assume Isaiah McKenzie, whose contract has also expired, given the suspension, whatever he did, we'll never know. Maybe we'll know eventually if he tells us the story. Lord knows that we're not going to hear it from Chris Ballard or Shane Steichen. With Isaiah McKenzie leaving, I really like what Juwan Winfrey gave this past preseason. I think he has a little bit of potential. I know he's not like the youngest cat in the world, but at 27 years old, if he's not young, I ain't young, and I'm pretty young. So Juwan Winfrey's a guy that I would like to see at least get brought back and given a chance to kind of show us again what he's got going into next season. That's a guy I want to re-sign. Who else? Tyquan Lewis is a name who I thought really contributed well this year as a rotational piece. But when you kind of look at the structure of this team right now, you got obviously the guys we have that are starters in Samson Ebicom and Kwity Paye. But then Adebawore was brought in. Titus Leo was on IR. Easy to forget about him, the draft pick, really an athletic freak. And just knowing that Ballard likes to draft at this position, I forgot to mention Dial Ndangbo as well, who I love. Tyquan Lewis, for me, it just kind of seems like his time in Indianapolis is up. I wouldn't be mad if they did re-sign him. I just predict for you that they won't re-sign Tyquan Lewis. Rigoberto Sanchez, listen, that's a good punter. I mean, why are you going to let a good punter go, right? Why are you going to let a good punter go? So if we were to re-sign just the guys I said I would re-sign right there, which are Juwan Winfrey, Danny Pinter, and Rigoberto Sanchez, just those three before and Taven Bryan, I wouldn't mind either. Again, I don't think they do re-sign Taven Bryan because we have Eric Johnson, and it's just, I don't know. It's again, maybe they do. In fact, let's just say they do. I don't think that moves the needle one way or another, but I'll keep him. I'll keep Taven Bryan. So Taven Bryan, Juwan Winfrey, Danny Pinter, and who else did I say? Rigoberto Sanchez. Those are kind of the guys that aren't big pieces or aren't like needle-moving pieces, but still obviously the punter and some good rotational guys. That right there is probably somewhere along the lines of $6 million, $7 million subtracted from the 64. So call it now $57 million after those re-signs, right? And now we're going to get into the good stuff, right? The stuff you actually care about. We've got the real guys, the real playmakers and guys that make a difference on this team every single Sunday. Michael Pittman Jr., Garner Minshew, Julian Blackmon, Kenny Moore, Zach Moss, and Grover Stewart. The big six. Oh, that's the best I got. You got a better name for them? Those are the guys. Those are the tough decisions because we're not going to keep all those guys. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Not all of those guys are going to be re-signed by the Indianapolis Colts, so we have to decide. We don't have to decide anything. Chris Ballard has to decide, but we're going to decide. Of those guys, who would you re-sign? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the guys I would re-sign and give you the reasons why. And then I'm going to tell you about the ones I'm going to let go. I think one of them is going to be controversial. But again, I'm going to tell you why. So I'm going to start re-sign Michael Pittman Jr. Must I explain to whoever it is that I have to explain why we would re-sign Michael Pittman Jr.? If I have to explain why, now you may not think we should, but if I have to actually explain to you the reasons why we should keep Michael Pittman Jr., maybe you should just shut off the show, right? Because I can't reason with you. I can't reason with you if you don't see the value in Michael Pittman Jr. But again, okay, $57 million after we re-sign those guys. Michael Pittman Jr., don't know the exact numbers, but probably like 20, 22. Call it 22 for the sake of it. I know the franchise tag is 23. Call it $22 million base salary. Okay, 57 minus 22, $35 million just after re-signing Michael Pittman Jr. Gardner Minshew, I would bring back. When you look, and this is controversial maybe a little bit, but this season would have gone down the tubes without Gardner Minshew. There's no debating that. If we had trotted out Sam Ehlinger, who I know some of you are clinging on to the fact that like he could be some guy. I'm not saying he stinks. I like what he brings to the table. We would have been like a 5-win team if Sam Ehlinger was out there. I'm just letting you know that right now. And you look at Gardner Minshew, I think on some levels it's going to come down to whether or not he thinks he could be put in a better position to start next season. But if you ask me, I don't see Gardner Minshew getting himself into another situation that's any different than the one he was in coming into this past season, which was, okay, I can go to a team that can use a quarterback but is also going to draft a quarterback. Kind of in the same spot. So for Minshew, why even change things, right? Everything is established over here in Indianapolis. And quite frankly, I think Indianapolis should bring him back, particularly not just with the uncertainty of the Anthony Richardson and his health. I know that's like an uncomfortable thing to talk about. We don't want to speak that into existence, but it's a reality that we can't ignore. That and what we went through with Andrew Luck and kind of knowing, I mean, having seen Scott Tolzien, like some of the quarterback play we have seen over the past 5 or so years, some of it has been awful. And I just think Gardner Minshew is able to come in and play damn well. Now, I know he has his limitations, but for me, I would just $5.5 million call it per year, a 2-year deal maybe. I would bring back Gardner Minshew, and it's a very easy decision for me to make. So with that, now we're talking about $30 million left before free agency and before the draft. Next guy I would re-sign, Julian Blackmon. Why? Because the safety room was terrible as is. Now, I will say this, he's a young guy, and he's a damn good safety. He was the only guy that was able to give us any consistency, really, at that position throughout the course of this season. And he has the injury concerns. We know the torn Achilles. We know he missed the rest of the season with a shoulder injury. He's kind of been banged up, man, but at his age, guys like Julian Blackmon don't exactly grow on trees. Now, he's probably going to demand anywhere from $7 to $10 million. I know that's a little bit of a range, but that's kind of right there. And my evidence for that is really just kind of looking around the league at some of the contracts that already exist and kind of seeing where does Julian Blackmon fit into that. Again, I'm saying $7 to $10 million a year. We'll see what the contract looks like, but that's what I'm viewing it as, and I would re-sign him to that. So, Michael Pittman Jr., Gardner Minshew, Julian Blackmon, re-sign. $30 million minus $9 million, we'll call it for Julian Blackmon. $21 million. Next guy that I would re-sign of the big six, if you will, is Kenny Moore. I think coming into this past season, there was a lot of questions about Kenny. I think he answered all of them. And again, with the secondary struggling the way it did, it's hard for me to imagine with the lack of depth we already had at corner that you would let your best one go, particularly because he's a specialist in the slot. That's a pretty tough position to play because you also have to be able to help in run support. Everyone has to be able to tackle, but Kenny Moore is really great in run support. For me, tough not to bring him back. He's still under the age of 30. I think he still has one more good contract of top-level play in him. I think Kenny Moore, for me, is a no-brainer to bring back. The question is, what's he going to demand? Good question. My guess is, I don't know. $10 million? $10 million a year? $12 million a year? Something along those lines. Maybe he gives us something a little bit team-friendly, but I would bring him back. And now you're talking $64 million, right? We were at $30 million, Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore. I mean, what do we have? I don't know how to do math, but it sounds like we have about $15 million left going into free agency, going into the draft. So we're already in a spot. Now, I know, again, this is not an exact science. I'm not like a cap aficionado. I'm really just doing like some basic bullshit math. To be honest, I could be completely wrong, right? When it comes to how the salary cap is going to work out, I'm learning this as I go, okay? Don't take my word as the gospel. I'm just talking about why I would re-sign certain players. So those are the guys I would re-sign, which means of the big six, there's two of them I'd let go. And if you're paying attention, you already know who they are. Now I'm going to start with the easy one that I'm going to let go, and I'm going to say Zach Moss. And quite frankly, it's as simple as this. We just signed Jonathan Taylor, 3 years, $42 million. We saw Trey Sermon give us great work, and we already know what Shane Steichen can do for the running game. I think when you have him in-house, and quite frankly, you look at the fact that, in my opinion, the Colts have done a good job drafting running backs in the mid-rounds. You look at guys like Marlon Mack, Jordan Wilkins, I thought gave us good work. I just think it's hard after you gave JT a contract to give Zach Moss a contract that's going to cost around, I don't know, $4.5, $5 million, something to that effect. He's going to have an opportunity to go somewhere else and potentially be a starter. I think it's just going to work out where you just have to let Zach Moss go. And I trust the Colts. You can't get complacent here because obviously coming into this season without Zach Moss, we would have been screwed. But Trey Sermon I thought was good. I think you get him, you draft a guy, and you kind of see where things go, and you hope JT stays healthy. I would let Zach Moss go. That's the easier of the two decisions for me. Now, the big one for me, Grover Stewart, I would let go if I was the Indianapolis Colts. He is now on the wrong side of 30. I know he has a lot of good play left in him. I think it's going to have to be for another team. What conflicts me about this is that I know that he is perhaps the most important guy on this defense. At least he was this year, right? I mean, Grover Stewart is a prototype of a run stopper. And again, there's just not a lot of guys built like him, right? I mean, he was spectacular for the Colts, period. But you look around the league at guys who have given his level of production. You're talking about a contract that's going to be somewhere in the range of, I don't know, 12 to 16. Dare I even say freaking $17 million for a Grover Stewart? Maybe that suspension works against him a little bit, but he ain't going to be cheap. Grover Stewart, if we were to re-sign him with everyone I just said, would basically take most of our salary cap. Now, I know there's going to be some finagling that gets done, but DeForest Buckner is already, at least in terms of his base salary, the highest paid defensive tackle in football. Now, there's things like incentives and like signing bonuses. He doesn't have the largest cap hit in the league, but he's amongst the largest cap hits in the league. And when you just look at the base salary, DeForest Buckner is the highest paid defensive tackle in football. So you take that into account. How can you possibly dedicate nearly $40 million, call it $35, $40 million to the defensive tackle position? I think you got to back up and go young there because DeForest Buckner, while in his prime now, in a few years' time, is going to be around the same age as Grover Stewart, 30, 31, 32 years old. And you're going to want to make sure that you have the next guy rising up in there. For me, the unfortunate reality is that this is how this type of things work. The most difficult decision I would have in re-signs is Grover Stewart, and I would ultimately opt to let him walk, as ridiculous as that sounds. And that's the one I'm curious to hear what you guys think about, because I'm conflicted, but as it currently stands, that's where I'm at. I just briefly started looking in to some of the defensive tackles in this draft. There's a couple guys I think have the potential to be some good run stoppers, and we'll talk about them more as the season goes on. But that right there was about everything I have to say today about the re-signs. Of course, this will be fluid. We will continue to talk about these things as the offseason progresses. I'm not going anywhere. Every single week for the rest of the offseason, you will never get a week without me. My goal is to make this the funnest offseason you've ever had as a Colts fan. And it started today, and it will continue with the next episode and the next 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 and the next, right? So without further ado, that was the episode. My name is Justin. This right here was the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. And as always, go Colts.